Hello, Bill.
Good morning, Matt.
Third time's a charm, my friend.
We've recovered a minor technical glitch, but everything is in order. It is
I love
Friday.
that sweater.
Oh, thank you.
I love your sweater, man.
You can credit Gina Louise for that, too, because I can't shop for myself.
I don't buy anything unless my wife and another female sign off on it. And even then, I don't always pull it off. So I don't trust my sartorial judgment one bit.
We are recording on a Friday. It may be, Matt, that maybe we have to shift to Fridays because every day is such a train wreck. That
somebody said that the I can't think of the guy's name. Who's the guy who went on TV and said he wouldn't testify? He wouldn't give Mueller his emails.
Right. Sam Numbrick. So that was Monday.
Okay. Somebody said that was this week.
Right, that was this week.
No, that was like a month ago.
No.
Clearly. It's hard to believe.
Right. Like, you really need to do a weekend thing, end of the week thing to sort of like collect yourself and say, what the hell just happened? And try to make sense of it all.
There's still no guarantee that while we're taping this, something crazy won't happen.
Well, of course. It was already a 24/7 world, and Trump just puts it on overdrive. So, if I may plug something,
Please.
early. Here in Northampton, Massachusetts, we have the country's oldest municipally owned theater, the Academy of Music, which is a gorgeous theater. And it's having a fundraiser tomorrow, and the fundraiser is called the Valley Letters Project. And I'm reading one of the letters. So basically, we're taking people, historical figures who have a connection to Western Massachusetts, and recollecting a time when people wrote letters. When people had the time to collect their thoughts and put it on a piece of paper, when we weren't living in a 24/7 universe. I'm reading a letter from Frederick Law Olmsted, the famous landscape architect who did Central Park in New York City, but also did Forest Park in Springfield, Massachusetts, and also several of the grounds of the college campuses around these parts. He wrote a famous letter to Abraham Lincoln during the Civil War. So I'm going to be reading that.
That's cool.
And it hopefully will transport us all back into a more I don't know if it was a better time, Actually, I just saw a concert by Jonathan Richman who was talking about nostalgia, and he was like, there are things that before we had all this internet, things were better, but there was slavery, so it was a mixed bag. It was a mixed bag back then.
Yeah, that's the thing. You always have to be careful with the nostalgia, talking about the halcyon days, But in many ways, things were better, involving writing letters. I think we can all get behind that.
But be that we are in this time, in this crazy time, before we dive into any Trump craziness, we have midterm election craziness, which I wrote about at Politico this week. We had the primary in Texas on Tuesday, which was notable because in the Houston area, 7th district, there were 4 Democrats running. This is a district that is Republican held, but voted for Clinton. So Democrats are very eager to pick off this seat. And the Democrat Congressional Campaign Committee, which is the official campaign arm for the Democratic Party for the House, they'd already been signaling, look, we're getting involved in primaries. We are going to try to ensure that we maximize our chances for pickup opportunities this year, which is not unprecedented. They would do that. Rahm Emanuel was very aggressive in primaries in 2006, but they really didn't do it in 2008 and 2010 and 2012. I talked to a former DCCC person for my article named Ian Russell, who explained to me... D-Trip.
As we call it.
Explained to me that in 2012, because California has the so-called jungle primary, or top 2, there was a district that Obama ran very well in, but was Republican held. I think it was became an open seat, and 4 Democrats ran for it and 2 Republicans, all on the same ballot. And the way it works in California is whoever's the top 2 in the primary, regardless if party moves on to the general, the Democratic vote splits amongst 4, the Republican vote splits amongst 2, 2 Republicans advance to the general. and the Democrats lose it. Would have been an easy pickup that year. So in 2014, the D-Trip says, "Okay, this has to stop. We got to get involved again." So that's where it began, and they end up getting that seat. And so that seat in California is the 31st. There was a guy named Pete Aguilar who was a mayor, and it ran well in 2012. But he was up against both an Emily's List endorsed candidate and a guy named Joe Baca who had an A rating from the NRA. And the D-Trip had to go in and say, look, Pete Aguilar is our guy. Joe Baca, he's not a good fit for this district. And I believe they spent some money on ads against one of the Republicans, trying to push the Republican down so there wouldn't be two Republicans winning. And Pete Aguilar just barely got into the general and eventually won the race. So that made them say, look, this works. We need to get involved with things beyond California, beyond top two situations. Now, they didn't spend money on other Democrats. They didn't have opposition research attack ads against other Democrats, but it was more kind of talking to reporters, talking to PACs, letting them know what the DCC's opinion was that did the trick. And that kind of talking helps other donors and PACs signal where they should put their money. So here we are in 2018. The suspicion of Democratic Party establishment operations is heightened coming out of the 2016 presidential primary. But the DCCC is escalated its involvement, it seems. And so in Texas 7, there are 4 Democrats running. One of them named Laura Moser, who is a Bernie endorser. A lot of progressive activist groups had gotten behind her candidacy. But the D-Trip dug up a quote from hers in Washingtonian magazine, where she's talking about living in Washington. She's a Texas native, but was living in D.C. And she says how she'd rather have her teeth pulled out by anesthesia than to move to her grandparents' house in Paris, Texas. Now, Paris is 5 hours away from Houston, so it's nowhere near this district. But the DCCC publishes on its website an opposition research memo highlighting this quote, though making it sound like she's talking about all of Texas, not just Paris, Texas, as a way to say there's no way this person's going to win in November. This quote, I mean, this wasn't said outright, but the clear implication is this quote's going to be rammed down her throat by Republicans. It would be a disaster. We can win this seat, but not with her. It doesn't endorse anybody else. Just basically says the Democrats don't vote for her. Moser turns the tables. It's a badge of honor. The Washington establishment is trying to force me out of this race. Her election day vote is better than her early vote. And so she's not doesn't come in first, but she makes it to a runoff for May 22nd. And now you have the progressive activist community, which already weren't big fans of the DCCC, and I can get into that. Now it's like a tectonic battle for the soul of the party. Let's show the DCCC they don't want progressives. They want to lean on their wealthy corporate donors. They're trying to shut us out of this party. Let's prove to them that they can't do that.
Which is part of a larger story of the decline of political parties and their organizations. And there probably was a time when the D-Trip controlled all sorts of money and opinion leaders, and if you got on the wrong side of them, it would have been the end of you. But now, actually, maybe it's good, right? Maybe you're rooting. Maybe you want the D-Trip to come after you because you can cast them as the establishment and you as the outsider in very Trumpian fashion.
Well, you certainly, as if the D-Trip thought they could be overt about it, they have been disabused of that theory. It's still, and then there's another example in Texas. I think the guy's name was Hullings. Forgive me for getting his name. But it was Texas 23rd. This is Will Hurd's district. So it's a very Latino district, definitely swing. And Hurd is a bit of a moderate Republican, relatively speaking, and could very well keep his seat, but he's considered vulnerable. D-Trip signaled their support for a more moderate Democrat. They didn't get as nasty as they did in Texas 7, but the person that they had signaled their preference for, who got a lot of donations because of that signaling, came in fourth. So that is an example of, even trying to be subtle, they were not effective in getting who they want. Now, it may be that they were right in wanting him. Maybe he would have been a better candidate than who is going to end up being the nominee. They have a runoff to do there too, so I can't say just yet. So there's a couple of factors there. One is, as you're pointing out, do parties have any kind of ability to shape the field the way they used to? Now, when I talked to Ian Russell, who's now at a place called Beacon Media, he was like, this worked in 2014, not just in that California district, but there are a couple other places. There's the Omaha district in Nebraska, where Brad Ashford won in 2014, and a northern Florida district, Gwen Graham won there. Those are places that didn't have very divisive primaries, but according to Russell, they moved early to shore up those candidacies and make sure they didn't have complicated primaries. And so that was a very bad Democratic year. So from his perspective, they were able to pick their spots and minimize the damage. Now, when I talk to people at Democracy for America or Progressive Change Campaign Committee or Justice Democrats, they'll tell you the D-Trip's record is horrible. They had a terrible 2014. They had a terrible 2010. Look at the carnage that has laid waste to the Democratic Party. These guys are in lockstep with the donor class and the corporatists, and they think you win with milquetoast moderates when what they really need is robust progressive populists, and the D-Trip just doesn't get it. Whether there's different opinions whether it's nefarious that they want to lose and they just want to fatten the pockets of their consultant friends, or they're well intentioned but just aren't good at what they do. That's the narrative that has. And it's not a recent narrative on the left. There are people who hate on the DCCC. Going back to the early blog days. Because back in 2006, Rahm muscled into a few primaries. There was, in one of the more famous cases in Illinois, they went heavy on Tammy Duckworth when there was a more liberal candidate who had ran respectably but lost. And that was a very close primary that Duckworth won by a little bit and then lost the general. So that made folks on the left say, these guys don't know what they're doing. They had a good candidate here and they elbowed her out and they still lost. Now, of course, Duckworth is now a senator, so it's not like she was. She was an Iraq War vet. She was a double amputee. Like she had a story to tell, and that was Rahm's thinking at the time. Also in 2006, you have a couple people, a guy named Jerry McInerney in California, in Northern California, and John Hall in upstate New York. These were more progressive candidates that the D-Trip did not feel confident about in the primaries. And when they won their primaries, the D-Trip didn't rush in to celebrate. And sometimes the story gets told on the left that the DCC, hung them out to dry, which is not completely correct because they did come in late in both those races. The D-Trip often moves money late to help people get over the finish line. So is this a case of the D-Trip, recognizing, hey, we got it wrong early. They proved themselves, and so we got in and helped them. Or is it a case of the D-Trip doesn't know what it's doing and jumped on the bandwagon late? Depends on your perspective.
I'm just happy I got you saying D-Trip. you insider. Let me say this. I think Will Hurd. So there's many. We're touching on some foundational challenges in our political system right now, including the fact that the political parties are weak. I just interviewed the guys who wrote the book How Democracy Dies, which I highly recommend. They're coming up on my podcast, Matt Lewis and the News. And I also interviewed for the podcast Joe Trippi, who ran. He was the media consultant for Doug Jones. So these topics, basically the incentives are for the most crazy, extreme, partisan, angry person to win a primary. And the parties really no longer have any control over gatekeeping functions or what they call peer review in the How Democracies Die book. So that there's a lot of structural problems that I think are disincentivizing civility and compromise and incentivizing, chaos and anger and polarization and tribalism and all that. One of the problems that you hinted at a little bit just by mentioning it is Will Hurd. I mean, Will Hurd, and I don't blame Democrats for trying to win a seat. You can't, right? I mean, like, if Democrats have every right to try to win that seat. But the fact that Will Hurd is vulnerable, I mean, this is a guy who I think is really a highlight of the Republican Party right now, who's, kind of quietly doing really good work. He's a good spokesman, kind of a rising star, conservative but not crazy. The fact that Will Hurd is the type of guy who's vulnerable when all these other people are in safe seats is one of the structural problems that I think we have right now. If there's a wave that comes in and knocks out, Republicans, the first Republicans to go will be the best. Is that fair to say?
Well, if you think the best are the people who are not, the most, lockstep conservative, Democrats lost a whole ton of.
This is a matter of semantics, but as far as I know, I haven't done a proper vetting of Will Hurd, but I would argue he's a legit conservative if we're talking about political philosophy. Now, he may be temperamentally more moderate, but I could be wrong, but I don't know that it's fair to call him a moderate.
Well, I think that's also a reason why you don't see Democrats all that excited about keeping him around. I mean, back in the day when the two parties weren't as ideologically pure, you might not see one party go after an incumbent from another party if they were doing business together. I can count on you to work on my legislation, and we can craft stuff that's going to make the country work. So I don't really need to pull my resources into knocking you out. Now, if you're a nice guy, you're not a crazy person, I respect you for that, but you never actually vote for my legislation or even consider voting for my legislation, what's the point of having you around?
Right. All I'm talking about is if you believe that it's good for the Republican Party to have, serious, thoughtful, competent, experienced people who, in office, it's problematic that the first guy to go, if we don't know how big the wave is going to be, but as soon as the wave breaches the levees, the first guy knocked out is going to be Will Hurd, right? I mean, you know what I'm saying?
Well, the first guy's always going to be knocked out the people who are in the swingier districts, and in the swing districts, you have to walk a careful line usually. So those are going to be the people who are going to be the least adherent to orthodoxy.
Right.
But that's true on both sides of the aisle.
Yeah. No, I agree. I mean, I'm making, look, I just interviewed the How Democracies Die guys, men, which means I've spent the last couple of weeks reading the book. So I've been thinking deeply about our system and how to preserve liberal democracy and norms and all that. So that's the context that I'm bringing to this. But let me bring up another. We didn't talk about this in our extensive pre-gaming, pre-production. But Chris McDaniel down in Mississippi, right now running against Roger Wicker, but may switch out because Thad Cochran is now stepping down, right? I don't know if you've been following this.
Well, McDaniel was going to run against – McDaniel jumped in the race against Wicker, who is an incumbent Mississippi senator running for re-election. Thad Cochran, who McDaniel ran against a few years ago –
in a very brutal, bitter runoff special, I don't know.
Right, which you covered, I remember, extensively at the time. And that a lot of the issue in that race was Cochran's age and faculties is now stepping down for health reasons. So now you got two races in play.
Let me just say, in fairness to the horrible people who were supporting Chris McDaniel, their main allegations against Thad Cochran were both correct, right? So it was he's doddering, he may not be out, he is stepping down, and there have been reports of him not being very coherent recently, not knowing how to find the Senate floor. And then the other one was that he was allegedly having an affair with his assistant or a staffer. I think they got married right after that.
Because his wife was, I think, suffering dementia. Right. So it's not your typical extramarital affair situation.
it was the campaign that they ran against Dad Cochran was scurrilous and unchivalrous, and it was horrible. But I do want to make the point that they actually were probably right about about like their main points. And now Chris McDaniel is running, and here's the question I have, and again, this goes back to me being in the how democracies die thinking, right? But we've got a couple examples of these kind of Chris McDaniel type of alt-right people running. And there are two of them that I think are interesting. One of them is Matt Bevin, who had attended cockfights or something in Kentucky. He ran against Mitch McConnell. This very similar race to the one that McDaniel ran against Cochran, except obviously, in both cases the incumbent establishment guy wins. But then Matt Bevin goes on to be elected governor a couple years later. The other example, though, is Paul Nealon, who ran against Paul Ryan in a primary, never got close, got clobbered. But he was endorsed by like Sarah Palin, Laura Ingraham, Ann Coulter. He's now running again and has really come out as like a pretty overt anti-Semite.
Right.
And so it's interesting to me. I don't know if Chris McDaniel, because here's the theory that I have, is that when these fringy candidates run the first time, they're not quite as dangerous. But once they sort of run a few times, I think that you get used to them a little bit, and maybe they don't scare you as much. So maybe like Chris McDaniel now, because we're used to him, because he's been around, he's kind of paid his dues by running.
Well, also you're also living in Trump's world. So on the Republican side, how does anyone seem so crazy? You have to be an outright anti-Semite to be too crazy to run it.
The Overton window has expanded. So anyway, it's a lot to throw at you, my friend.
Well, just to bring it back to the Democratic side for a little bit. Well, I think there are people on the left that look at what's happened to the Republican Party, where the Republican establishment had, they didn't like Christine O'Donnell running in Delaware. They weren't happy with what happened with Todd Akin in Missouri, and they tried to steer the party towards more sane candidates. But the Trump train came, and that they became dominant in the party, and so that the more conventional analysis of what's electable got thrown out the window. I think the left looks at the Democratic Party, and one of the people I talked to, said they're running on the logic of 20 years ago. You want to have these progressive populist candidates running. Who cares what district it is? You need authenticity. You need ambition. You need ideas that are going to resonate with people. And I don't think we know yet whether what's happening on the right, the way Trump has reshaped the party, is fully analogous with what Bernie has done on the left. Obviously, there is a very healthy and fervent Bernie contingent, but is it as broad as what's happened on the right? And from the DCCC's perspective, they say, look, we're not ideological. We don't really care one way or the other. We're looking at this district by district. Who is a good fit for these districts? Who's going to win today? All your talk, Matt Lewis, about what's good for governance and the fabric of democracy, or what the left is saying about single payer and fight for 15. They don't care any of that. They're built to win today. So they look at the district, they look at the polling, they look at the candidates' abilities to either have money or raise money. They look at the quality of their campaign team. And they say, I think this person can help us pick up the seat. Right. And I think this person can't help pick up the seat.
Gatekeepers, for whatever reason, look, there's so many incentives pushing people to the extremes, to the polarizing them. But I would say that party apparatchiks, how do I say that? Whatever. Party bosses, political operatives, skew pragmatic, skew moderate for whatever reason. So I even if they're trying to be purely agnostic on this and just think strategic, for whatever reason, they tend to play it safe. So I get that. By the way, you came up my podcast with Joe Trippi. You come up, so check that out. But Trippi, I was asking about the 2020 Democratic primary, and he said that there's a real. This is something he's reiterating that I heard him say a few months ago. That there's a real hunger out there for a candidate who would be willing to be civil and compromise and bring people together, and that he's convinced that if that person ran against Donald Trump, that person would win. But he's also, and I don't want to put words in his mouth, but I think he said he's also convinced that that person can never win a Democratic primary in 2020.
Well, I don't know if we know that yet. I hate to disagree with Joe Trippi because obviously he's been in the trenches and he knows a whole.
And he did, of course, he did the Doug Jones. This is all premised on him having run the Doug Jones race, and that's how your name came up because I talked about your theory of the generic Democrat.
Right.
So.
I mean, so he seemed to be somewhat in sync with what I was saying there, as far as what would match up well against Trump. At the end of the day, in this midterm election, we now what the D-Trip is doing is becoming very prominent. You now essentially going to have a proxy war in Texas 7. Every time the D-Trip goes anywhere, the left is on top of them. You got a guy in Pennsylvania who is complaining the DNC is trying to muscle him out and their claim is because he's too progressive. But I think at the end of the day, some candidates are going to get nominations who are in the progressive populist mold, and some candidates are going to get nominations who are in more of a traditional, relatively moderate mold. It's not going to be an army of one or an army of another. And if there's a Democratic wave, it's probably going to carry both kinds of candidates into the House. So both sides will cite their, just like in Virginia, you got established folks will say, look, Ralph Northam won, Tom Perriello didn't. You thought you need a Perriello, and he's a perfectly nice guy, but Northam was a former Republican who ran a very moderate race, and he won. And then folks on the left say, well, that's because of the more progressive state legislative candidates that were on the ground, that they ginned up the turnout, they drove everything. So everyone's going to have their talking points, and it's not going to get settled this year. It's going to spill into 2020.
Right.
And
the interesting thing about the Doug Jones example, as you know, is he was temperamentally moderate, and he was talking about civility. Someone's calling me. Mom. Voicemail. Don't you ever bother me when I'm working. We love Mom, but we'll call Mom right back. What was I going to say? So he was temperamentally moderate, talked about civility, he talked about compromise, but philosophically, pretty hardcore liberal. I mean, not moderate philosophically, and so it complicates matters.
I mean, Jones. I think there is. People pick and choose their data points a lot. I don't want to, call out any names of people that I've talked to and be rude, but you have people. Doug Jones didn't. He was pro-choice. He was unabashedly pro-choice, and he was unabashedly for respecting climate science and acting on global warming. So the two things unusual for a Democrat in Alabama to be for. But he was not deeply economically populist. He did not embrace $15 minimum wage, I don't believe. Correct me if I'm wrong there. I know he was not for single payer. I mean, so there's a debate going on in the party because obviously all the progressive populists want single payer candidates, Medicare for all. Look, this polls well. Stop being so overly cautious. Just run single payer candidates all across the board. And after what happened with Moser in Texas 7, there were two DCCC memos that leaked out on the same day to left-leaning organizations. I'm sure that was not a coincidence. And one of them was a polling analysis on healthcare, which basically argued that the things that poll well are improvements to the Affordable Care Act, empowering the government to negotiate for better drug prices, giving middle-class families a tax break for their healthcare costs, and only talked about single payer in terms of here are the mean things Republicans are going to say about you. They're going to accuse you of being for single payer. So it wasn't a robust argument for running on single payer. And so that got the left's hackles up that the DCCC is trying to basically squelch discussion of the issue. Doug Jones did not run on single payer, ran on that kind of let's fix ACA kind of messaging. And if you raise that with folks on the left, they just kind of, well, sure, but look what he did on abortion. Look how he rallied the African American folks. He's talking about his civil rights work as an attorney. I don't think it's the end of the discussion on single payer, but it's not crazy for the DCCC to say, look, this stuff polls very, very strongly. And you can show me a poll here and there that says, look, some people like single payer, but that doesn't automatically mean it's going to do well once the rubber hits the road and it's faced with a carpet bomb attack from the right. I don't think that means the left has to surrender on the subject, but it's not out of bounds for the DCCC to do its own clinical analysis, not coming from a place. I mean, they don't want to reverse engineer it. One guy sort of accused the DCCC to me. I didn't put this in the story, but sort of accused the DCCC of reverse engineering their memo. But you can make the same case on the other side. Like you just want it to be single payer so badly, you don't want to look at other data that says, well, maybe that's not the best path to go here. There are people. One of these other DCCC memos that leaked was after the Vegas massacre, and it was really less of a memo than like a panicked email, blitzed out to counseling candidates. Look, don't rush out talking about gun control right away here. Let's not politicize this right away. Now, of course, there's a huge attitude on the left saying that's NRA speak, that you shouldn't talk about solutions right away. And so this was a chance to sort of beat up the DCCC and sort of sound like the NRA. It wasn't that long ago when all the progressive populists were raving about Rob Quist in Montana, who was caressing its rifle like it was a child. So no one's perfect here. And I think both sides, it would behoove both the DCCC and the progressives to say, look, we all want to win the House. We may disagree about this or that, but at the end of the day, we all want to win the House. You're going to get some candidates. We're going to get some candidates. And let's just, we're going to maybe have some friction in certain districts. And I can't say that people should just shut up whenever that happens. But you might want to contain the rhetoric. So once the primary season is done, everyone can get on the same page.
Right. There was a poll that came out. I think it was a poll. Or polls. Anyway, there's some thought now that in the Senate, these Democrats are in trouble. Heidi Heitkamp and Joe Manchin and Claire McCaskill. And I don't know if you saw that, but I'm starting to think that it may be that Republicans, this would be a bizarre outcome, but the Republicans actually pick up Senate seats and lose the House. I don't think that's an absurd theory at this point. I don't know if there's much precedent for that kind of thing happening.
Oh, I'm sure that, I haven't gone back and looked at it recently, but there are certain zigzaggy things I recall in certain election years.
But this is I could get winning seats in one chamber and losing seats in another, but this would be like a wave that switches control of the House while Republicans pick up in the Senate. I don't know if you have any thoughts or if you've seen that.
Well, I saw the poll. There's a certain logic to that. There are more Republican seats in bluish areas in the House right now. There's more low-hanging fruit there, whereas the Senate map is skewed the other way. There's a lot of Democrats in Trump states. Very few obvious pickup opportunities for Democrats.
So in a way, it's just a market correction.
Yeah, and it's reflective of. We don't know exactly what's going to happen yet, but if that happened, it would be reflective of the general polarization of the country, where people have ideologically sorted themselves, or a completion of the ideological sorting process with some few extra wrinkles, with say Trump becoming more of making Republicans more protectionist and Democrats becoming more internationalist. So if more interior Midwest and West states go Republican in the Senate, while upscale, New York, California, New Jersey, Houston, Texas. I mean, this Texas 7 is a really wealthy urban district, urban and suburban district. Those places go Democrat. That's more of a continuation of the demographic trends that we've seen.
I also think there's just the political universe, the political environment, and there's always, you can always say that there's going to be an October surprise could change the trajectory of things, right? And we always talk about that. But I think in the case of Trump, it's even more volatile than normal. I mean, if Election Day lands, the day after he gets some deal with North Korea, that's very different than if it lands the day after something on Stormy Daniels comes out. I mean, we try to pick the best candidates. We try to run the best campaigns. But at the end of the day, so much of this could come down to something Donald Trump does or happens in the world. And again, that's always true to a certain degree. But I feel like the volatility is even greater now than normal.
I 86, which was Reagan's 6-year term. So typically, 6-year itch is the phrase. That's usually when the midterms really go badly for the president's party. This was right after the failed Reykjavik summit, but Reagan walking out and not giving up Star Wars was a popular position at the time. And the tax bill got signed into law. The famous 1986 tax reform, that got signed in October of that year. And so there was a lot of good Republican news going into that election, but it was a terrible midterm for Republicans. So I do think there's potentially a certain limitation of what a president can do. I mean,
but that's back when all politics was local. I really think one of the, and by the way, let me just say, I went back and looked at some of my predictions, and I have this transcript where it's like I perfectly predicted New Hampshire, I perfectly predicted Iowa. So there's this, I'm beating myself up, but I had this revisionist history that I was getting so many things wrong. But I do think one of the things that people like us got wrong or have gotten wrong in recent years is we were still living under the assumption that all politics is local, that there was this invisible primary, that you had to actually have an organization in certain states. You had to, go to these stupid pancake breakfasts and VFW. You had to sort of play the game. All politics is local, and it certainly, Tip O'Neill's book. I mean, that's how it was back then. But now I think it's much more national. It's much more driven by the media cycle, but it's
also possible that all politics is demographic, which means in that sense, it's relatively immune to the cycles. I mean, Trump's approval rating is much lower than what it should be for a president presiding over this kind of economy. People's minds are made up about Trump in large respect based on
what was his approval rating? But what was his approval rating the day he won the presidency?
Bad. I mean, he's never been over 50% this entire time. So it could be that, look, let's say Trump does a deal with Kim Jong Un, which, quite frankly, I completely expect him to do. I expect they'll do something.
I was hoping we could get through this whole show without mentioning, without going into detail at least about North Korea, tariffs, or Stormy Daniels. But here we are.
I think I said this on the show before. I've certainly said it in private conversation. I don't believe Trump wants to start a new war. I don't think he ever. It's certainly not a nuclear war. I don't think Trump thinks that's fun. I think he likes to talk trash.
He would be right. He would be right that it's not fun.
I think he likes to talk trash about it and sound like a tough guy. I don't think he really wants to, push the button. So here's a chance to go and say, I talk like a big tough guy, and I strengthen our bargaining hand going into the table, and I look Kim Jong Un right in the eye. Look what a great deal we have, and there's peace amongst the land. And it's all because of me. And the foreign policy wonks may say you've actually done nothing to actually stop this nuclear program. He's still sitting all his information. Nothing's really changed here. You give a whole lot of legitimacy and without not a lot of concession, and he would just blow through that and spin all day long. And his side, people who are supportive of Trump, would buy it, and people who aren't supportive of Trump would say this is a joke, and the political needle wouldn't move at all.
That's definitely within the realm of possibility.
So that's why I don't want to completely discount the possibility that there are external events that could change people's perceptions. I mean, I don't think that's an impossible scenario, but certainly over the course of this year, you see minor. Trump passes the tax bill and he bumps up from 35 to more like low 40s or 40. There's a certain degree of sensitivity to external events, but it's certainly not a big wide range that he's been working with.
Yeah, but you're also assuming that there's a direct correlation between Trump's approval rating and how people would vote in the midterms, which I guess what I'm saying is that these external events could boost Republican chances without necessarily making people like Trump more. But anyway, it's a fine.
Well, it's possible. I mean, it seems like it's hard to remove Trump from the equation. He is seeped into every aspect of life. You've always talked about politics as downstream from culture. We're in Trump culture. Trump affects all of culture.
We've defined deviancy down.
And the animation. I mean, and this sort of, I think the progressive left, to get back to the DCCC discussion, the progressive left wants to argue that just being against Trump is not enough. You need to have a proactive, ambitious agenda to get people to be enthusiastic. And there is some evidence in the Northam campaign and the Doug Jones campaign. I mean, Jones didn't mention Trump at all, and his actual policy agenda was pretty thin, but Democratic enthusiasm was still pretty strong. So it may well be that the anti-Trump element is plenty to get Democrats excited, and there's enough Republicans who are squeamish about what has happened. Obviously, there are Trump loyalists, but there are Republicans don't like the tariffs and don't like going to talk to Kim Jong Un and don't like talking about taking guns away without due process. For have some people say, you know what, I'm going to take a pass on this one.
Trippy, though, I will say Trippy, I think, would argue that Alabama was very unique because their theory was, according to the polling, that in Alabama, if there's a controversy, Roy Moore wins. So Trippy actually argues that the sex scandal helped Roy Moore because it's a counterintuitive theory. You have to listen to the podcast, but he's got the numbers. But basically his theory was Doug Jones wants to quiet things down. Things shouldn't be exciting. This isn't a culture war. There aren't hot button issues. Let's calm things down. If Doug Jones could calm things down, he can win. When things get crazy and chaotic, and when Trump's in the news in Alabama, people go to their corners and people are forced to their polar sides.
Back to normalcy, Warren Harding.
And in Alabama, that's bad, right? In Alabama, that's especially bad because there's more Republicans than Democrats. So, by the way, not to plug the podcast or the books too much, but this is a really good book, How Democracies Die. And one of the things I found out in the book that I didn't know is that Warren G. Harding had won 4% of the primary vote before the party bosses decided to nominate him.
Yeah, although there weren't a lot of primaries back then.
No, it wasn't the same, but it's still an interesting factoid.
No, he was like the 20th choice when the party couldn't agree what to do. And by that story, if we got the nomination, is really well argued, well explained in David Petrushka's book, 1920, Year of the Six Presidents.
David Petrushka,
I'm sorry,
our buddy, our friend.
I always pronounce his name because I'm terrible.
Well, if you think that's something, Warren G. Harding is torn apart. That's Ed Buchanan in Suicide of a Superpower. Not really, but I thought it would be fun to one-up you.
I think you have to jump, right?
I got to roll. But let's plug. I've just plugged my stuff, so why don't you plug your Politico piece?
Well, yeah. So, I think it was why can't the DCCC and the resistance get along? and the lead being, can the DCCC and the resistance, share a midterm election without driving each other crazy. So do check that out over at Politico.com and check out Matt Lewis's podcast, and we'll catch you next week.
And if it's not enough Matt and Bill for you, NZ Bear recommends listening to Bill guesting on my podcast last week. So check that out too.
Faithful superfan, NZ Bear.
I'm not sure he's a fan. He might be more of a troll, but we love him. We love him.
He's not going to appreciate that.
All right, check us out on Twitter at DMZ Show. Thanks, Bill.
Take care.